Hello, and welcome to the inaugural edition of our new podcast series, Controversies. I'm David Sylvan, the Director of Research at the Graduate Institute. The idea behind this series is to do a slightly deeper dive into one of the myriad controversies that roil the academic world, and actually to show what the practical as well as intellectual significance of these things is. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by a scholar who's a longtime collaborator of the Hirschman Centre at the Institute, but has recently started an extremely prestigious new gig. He's gone from the lousy weather conditions of Geneva to the sunny uplands of Edinburgh in Scotland. And I want to welcome you, Deval Desai, and ask you just to tell us a tiny bit about your background.
Thank you, David. And you may be able to hear in the background the soft pitter-patter of rain that is the persistent backdrop to Edinburgh. So it's a real pleasure to be joining you for this. And I hope the inaugural version of Controversies goes well. As you mentioned, I have been a postdoctoral fellow with the Hirschman Centre for several years and have just started as a lecturer in international economic law at the law school at Edinburgh University. Prior to that, I have a background that spans both academic scholarship and development practice. So I've worked with the World Bank on rule of law reform, so thinking about the structure of legal systems in countries in the global south, and in particular their regulatory and administrative systems. And at the same time in my scholarship, thinking about that particular problem from an academic angle, and also thinking more broadly about the place and function of development expertise in structuring those legal and regulatory systems.
Excellent. Well, that provides actually a perfect seg into what I wanted to talk to you about. So you have a piece that came out, I guess, not long ago in the Modern Law Review. And you're interested, and I'm just going to paraphrase the title, although it's not a terribly long title, you're interested in the so-called reform involving the rule of law, which is a catchphrase, and in particular the politics of this type of thing. And I wonder if I could just ask you to focus on the particular issue that really kind of permeates this article. I gather that a major part of the literature there is the issue of delegation. If you can boil down for us what you see as the kind of status quo ante in the way that people used to think about the issue of delegation. And then I want to ask you as a follow-up about the particular controversy that we now see emerging.
Thanks, David. It's fun to be able to talk about this piece. As you say, it came out pretty recently. It's in sort of one of the major generalist law journals in the English-speaking world. And so it's not an usual place where you'd see stuff that talks about development practice and development practitioners. It's trying to insert itself in a debate in a reasonably careful way. So there is a set of literature that talks about law in the administrative state. And that tends to be structured around and emerge from a set of cases in the global north, in particular Anglo common law and French civil law. And then theory is kind of built on it. And one of the basic questions is, in what ways does the state, assumed to be a constitutional state of some sort, delegate power and authority to administrators from its polity? So how do administrators get the power and authority to administer? What power and authority do they have? Who exactly is doing the delegating? And the basic administrative law question, how exactly should administrators exercise their power and authority, and under what constraints?
Well, if I could just jump in a second. I mean, one of the ways that, for example, my discipline, political science, talks about this is as a so-called principal-agent problem. And the idea is that if you want to try to figure out the functioning, or conversely, the dysfunctionality of certain types of policy arrangements, you want to look at the relation between principal and agent, and at the difficulties that the principal may have in controlling the agent, while at the same time delegating power. Is that the kind of gloss that the literature from your perspective is actually centered around?
So that's precisely it. And the underlying question for administrative lawyers and constitutional lawyers is on what legal principles does that happen? So to put it another way, administrative law writing has tended to be, and I'm generalizing quite significantly, but has tended to be pretty subjunctive to constitutional law theorizing. So the idea about a polity and its constituted power and authority is then the backdrop for how administration takes place and under what constraints, how agents act on behalf of their principles. So when it comes to writing about administrative states in the global south, in general, what we tend to read about is how southern states have their own gloss on that model, how they deviate from that model, how that model is limited in the south. But the story is basically you start with the constitutional issues and then you think about the administrative issues.
Okay, so if we can then focus on specifically this thing called PDIA, problem-driven iterative adaptation, if I'm understanding correctly, what we're talking about here is the various attempts to some degree, after the fact, attempts to some degree, a kind of collage in which grant-giving or development assistance agencies, which are of course obviously staffed by and funded for the most part by actors in the global north, are attempting to address this issue of delegation in terms of the way that the money, as I understand it, is actually dispersed. And to make sure, for example, that there aren't particularly egregious types of corruption, right? So if that's correct, then please tell me if I'm wrong about this. What exactly is the kind of twist that the PDIA people are actually proposing or claiming to do?
So that's exactly right. The rule of law people in development agencies are very much thinking about how to structure administrative action, how to structure principal agent problems to make the agents a better agent. And corruption is one of the big concerns there. So the development practice on that and development scholarship on that question has tended to follow the problem or the way in which the academic debate has been structured in the North, which we discussed a minute ago, which is start with a constitutional issue, move to the administrative issue. What the PDIA people did, which is kind of interesting, but from a very, very sort of mundane and practical level, was to say, look, in a lot of the places where we work, it's incredibly hard to settle a constitutional issue. And rather than spend all of your time trying to make a state look like a constitutional state on the basis of which you can do your kind of principled delegation of authority to administrators, let's just recognize and start with the fact that administration is occurring everywhere we look. Stuff is getting done. And then let's engage with that in a really practical and ordinary and everyday way, and then worry about the kind of background politics of that, the background politics of legitimacy and authority as we go along.
So is this what I mean, I could just interrupt for a second, is this what I mean in this case that I actually circled and underlined and then wrote apologies for the exclamation mark to, quote, turn administrative fiction into administrative fact?
So that's absolutely how I understand it. And my understanding of that is based on some of the reading of what this group of practitioners has been producing, but also as a participant in some of the projects that are influenced by them. So this is, just to give a little bit of context, this is a group of academics and practitioners mainly rooted at the Harvard Kennedy School who have long-standing ties with the World Bank, but also other development agencies. And they put on a very pragmatic hat and they say all of the big kind of principles about building modern states is unfeasible at best and damaging at worst. What we really need to do is think practically about specific administrative problems. And when they say turning administrative fiction into administrative facts, what they're saying is we see that administration occurs, but what we need to do is ground it in a political enabling environment, as they call it, such that it becomes sustainable over time. And the way, the framing that I'm trying to put around that is in that very kind of calm and practical use of the term political enabling environment rest a whole load of constitutional questions that administrative lawyers and constitutional lawyers have been thinking about for a very long time. And it's a really, really interesting bracketing move to say, you know, let's start with administrative fiction and then let's start with the actual the practices of administration, and we'll think about the constitutional stuff
I can give you analogous, as it were, episodes in the history of thought about, for example, domestic public administration. Um, but I want to focus just for a second on the critique, or at least the one critique that you actually highlight in your paper, which is this thing by Lant Pritchett with a concern particularly about South Sudan. Can you quickly just tell us the kind of core of Pritchett's critique about the PDIA?
Yeah, so Pritchett is one of the guys who's trying to think hard about PDIA. He sort of came up with the term along with Matt Andrews and Michael Woolcock, and he's been trying to develop it and also try and show its limits. And the story in South Sudan that he tells is, well, what does it actually look like to focus on the fact of administration? Basically, what's at stake in who you point to as doing administration on the ground anyway? And then how do you think about them not just as people who are administering stuff, providing social welfare or job programs or whatever it might be, to think about them not just as people who are, for example, delivering services, but also as political actors. So who exactly are the people who we identify as providing administration? And how do we understand them in a political context that can legitimate their provision of administration over time? And he's trying to suggest that that's actually quite a difficult political task. And he then starts to think a little bit about, well, to what extent should international actors and can international actors facilitate that sustained political enabling environment over time? He doesn't really answer that question, but for me, that's both a really important political question, but also one that lawyers might be well equipped to think about, even if they're not necessarily thinking about it in the context of development and states in the global south at the moment.
So let me just ask you, the final question that I want to ask you then about this is, if I can again go back to standard economics and political science terminology on this. So in effect, we could gloss the Pritchett critique of the PDIA, if I'm not completely bowdlerizing it, as something that basically says that people whom you've dealt with as agents are themselves principals. And in that regard, could you just give us the quick version, maybe a little bit more than the elevator speech version, but not incredibly long, just about how you see the kind of legal traditions or the legal literature that you're talking about as being helpful and or complementary to that particular critique?
Yeah, so the payoff of my article is essentially to say that those agents who are in themselves principles have, from an administrative law standpoint, to be thought of as a result as political actors. But the ways in which we think of them as political actors are not necessarily first and foremost in terms of delegation, which is to say, we haven't identified a group of people who are delegating to them legitimacy and authority. Instead, what the politics of those agents who are acting as principals has to do with the way in which they distinguish themselves from other competitors or other actors who might be occupying the same administrative space. That is, I frame it as a shift from thinking about the politics of delegation, keeping the administrative questions subjunctive to the constitutional ones, to one of autonomy, which is how different administrative actors make themselves autonomous from other actors in their space, which is fundamentally an administrative question that tends to relegate constitutional issues to the background, but is a way in which administrative law theorists do think about the politics of administrative actors, which is to say, it's if we take the premise that administrative actors are no longer going to be subjunctive to, administrative questions are no longer going to be subjunctive to constitutional ones, then what tools do we have to still think about the politics of those administrative actors? And I'm drawing on trying to suggest that we can draw on a different tradition within the administrative law literature to think about the politics of their administrative autonomy.
So, Deval, thank you so much for your willingness to participate and for the kind of really interesting insight there. In the meantime, I want to wish you a good day and wish you all the luck in your new job.
Thank you very much, David. It's been a real pleasure.
You have been listening Controversies, a podcast series produced by the Research Office of the Graduate Institute in Geneva.